I just gotten up. We were it was the day after Christmas, and we were going to go visiting. And it was quite early in the morning, and I had gotten dressed and was on my way to the kitchen to make some coffee. And we have a back staircase from the bedroom areas, and I always come down that staircase, and I'm usually the first one down. And the note was lying across the 3 pages across the run of one of the stair treads. And it was kind of dimly lit because it was very early in the morning. And I started to read it, and it was addressed to John. It said, Mr. Ramsey. And it said, we have your daughter. And it just wasn't registering. And I may have gotten through another sentence, like, I can't, we have your daughter, and I don't know if I got any further than that.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science on this 4th day of Christmas. On the 4th day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. Now, interestingly, on such a well-known song, traditional song, there's a lot of confusion about, is this calling birds or collie birds? Calling birds are, singing birds like mockingbirds, right? Collie birds is an old term referring to blackbirds. In other words, a bird that appears black, like coal. And so what's interesting just about this aspect in the song is just how we can all be aware of something and yet not be sure what it actually refers to. And the Ramsey case is kind of a lot like that. So at the beginning of this episode, I played you a clip, and you sort of hear a somewhat medicated sounding Patsy talking about the, waking up early on that morning on the day after Christmas. She was the first one up, according to her. Just sounding very foggy and very fuzzy, and she finds this note, and she's sort of half awake, and she doesn't really know what to make of it. And there's quite a lot of truth in the spirit of what she's saying there. I don't think what she's saying is true. I don't think she woke up and discovered the note, but I think there is truth in this whole idea of being worn out, and that's what we're going to deal with in this episode. We're going to investigate the sort of magic carpet ride on the way to that Christmas of 1996. We're going to look at the parties and festivities that the Ramsey family were sort of engaging in, basically in the month and couple of days leading up to Christmas. Before we get to that, my book on JonBenet Ramsey Christmas Star, dealing with the last photo. This is the very first analysis, in-depth analysis of the last photo and how it plays into this case. Very, very important information, and yet no one has really paid much attention to it. No one has apparently noticed the bow in JonBenet's hair. And so I've written a almost 100-page book dealing in depth with the implications of the bow and what inferences and insights we can draw from that. So that's available now on Amazon Kindle, so head on over there for that. It's $5.99. In terms of the episode yesterday about the murder weapon, we're going to be dealing with that in due course on this channel, but I'll also be dealing with it in more depth on Patreon. I'll also be doing 4 more episodes in this series, just dealing with the events basically 23 years ago today, in the JonBenet Ramsey case. If you'd like to stay up to date on those, please subscribe to this channel, ring the bell, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So, as so often happens in true crime cases, we start the story in the aftermath of the story. So in other words, often the suspect or the person who finds out what's going on, we get the story from them, and the story sort of starts kind of after whatever has happened happens, and so we start moving forward in time, but basically away from the events that actually happened, if that makes sense. And typically in true crime, the narratives deal with the events on the day of the murder, and then they go forward from there, and that's it. There's no real time spent on the what I call the post-meditation, but it's basically that phase that runs up prior to the events, right? And we know that in, for example, the Chris Watts case, there's a very important 5 to 6 weeks before that crime happened, and then also a very significant weekend before the crime happened, and arguably even a very important 2-week window before the crime happened. So that context is actually very important. And so what we're going to deal with here in this episode are the Christmas parties that occurred basically in the month before JonBenet's death. So if you had to ask yourself, what sort of Christmas parties were happening with the Ramseys, and you just had to ask yourself, okay, well, what comes to mind? What's sort of top of mind? Some people might say, well, it was Access Graphics celebrating, $1 billion in turnover, and that happened very close to Christmas. It appeared in the Daily Camera on December 21st. So literally just before Christmas, John Ramsey's business hit this incredible milestone, and it was a big moment, and so there was a lot to celebrate that year. Besides the business side, there was also the Christmas shopping side, and bear in mind the Ramseys were quite an extravagant family, that they lived quite large just in terms of their home, was quite a big house. They had a yacht, they had, I think, 1 or 2 airplanes, and they also had a cottage in Michigan. And so when they celebrated Christmas, they went quite large. I mean, they had Christmas trees in every room. It was all quite over the top, and so was the Christmas shopping. And if you go into the PB Works Encyclopedia on JonBenet Ramsey, you'll see a timeline, the events prior to December 10th, and there's reference made to a 40th birthday party celebration for Patsy on the 30th of November. So it was Patsy's birthday on the 29th of December, so basically 2 days before that CNN interview that you heard at the beginning. That was actually when it would have been Patsy's birthday, and so that was also going to be a big deal for her. If John's $1 billion in turnover was a big deal for him, well, Patsy's 40th birthday, especially for an ex-Miss Virginia, was going to be a very big deal for her. And then there was also the Lights of December parade that JonBenet was in. Now, bear in mind, JonBenet is sort of the queen sort of in this parade. She's sort of playing Little Miss Colorado, right? She's literally on her own float, sort of floating through the streets of Boulder in the first week of December, running up to Christmas. What's not mentioned in this timeline, I think very interestingly, because PB Works seems to only provide some information and not other information, PB Works actually also misspells my name as an author. Even though I've let them know, they just won't correct the way that my name's spelled, which I think is very interesting. But what's worth noting in this particular entry is that at the time that JonBenet was in this parade, and Burke was also there, the Ramseys were in New York Christmas shopping, so they were somewhere else, kind of doing their thing. And part of this Christmas shopping involved, heading to boutique, expensive toy stores like FAO Schwartz, and it was those gifts that literally appeared under the Christmas tree and in the crime scene. So that's when that happened. So, Christmas shopping, but not Christmas shopping as you and I would do. It's Christmas shopping where you would fly to New York and taking in a couple of shows and stay in hotels. And so, that was what was going on. And while they somewhere else, their children are somewhere else. And, you've also got to look at it from the perspective of Patsy's got her stuff going on, the shopping and the shows and whatever. John's got his stuff going on, the celebrations of his business. JonBenet's got stuff going on with regard to her pageants and so on. Then you've got to sort of ask, what was Burke sort of doing? Like when all of this was going on, what was Burke doing? And Burke was sort of kind of a hanger on at JonBenet's parade. He was basically there seeing his sister waving to the crowd, and he's sort of a shadow in that story. Then there was also a church party in the Ramsey home on the 13th of December. So we're now sort of halfway to Christmas. The Ramseys have come back from New York with their gifts, and now it's time for like a kind of a big church party. And when we say big, it's big in terms of this is the Ramsey scale of things, and so there were 150 people at this party on the December the 13th, attended by church friends of the Ramseys. Just 4 days after this huge bash in the house, there was a pageant for JonBenet, the little Colorado's Little Miss Christmas, which JonBenet won, and then JonBenet also won a Denver area pageant. I think she won a Santa Bear at that particular pageant, and it seems like that may have been the same day or close to that day. And then again, you won't find this in the PB Works timeline. Instead, you'll find this particular snippet in Steve Thomas's book JonBenet Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation. What he refers to is also just this really busy schedule, but especially for JonBenet, talking about all the pageants that year. And I think she did 2 trips to New York, saw 5 Broadway shows, and so on. And but importantly, she went to see the school nurse twice in December. This is JonBenet. So twice in December she went to see the school nurse, and both times Steve Thomas notes it was on a Monday after a weekend. And then before the Christmas break, Patsy arranged to have JonBenet perform for her classmates. So in addition to everything that was going on, JonBenet also did a little performance for her friends at school, and that meant her dressing up in her pageant outfit and singing and dancing, and this kind of sounded like it went on all day. It wasn't just kind of one little performance, it was a whole extravaganza. And according to Steve Thomas, it wasn't just to one class, it was many classes that she performed to. And then according to Thomas, that particular day JonBenet went home completely exhausted. Steve Thomas also references that JonBenet had a lesson in school that same day of the pageant, and it was that perfection and celebrity had a price. So that's kind of interesting, wouldn't you say? Just that juxtaposing that, it's almost as if JonBenet was kind of learning her own lessons, and you kind of have a similar thing with that with Reva Steenkamp just before her death. She was going to give a speech at a school talking about things like abuse, and she was shot hours before she could actually give that speech. So it's important to take note of this kind of stuff. And Steve Thomas also adds that on December 17th, so that was the day that she got the Little Miss Christmas crown. So that was literally a week before her death that she was in another pageant. And then he refers to the party at her parents' home. But I'm gonna deal with that a little bit later. I first want to deal with something Patsy says in Death of Innocence, and this is on page 97 of Death of Innocence, the book that the Ramseys wrote about the whole thing. And sorry, not 97, 99. And what Patsy says here is that she hadn't planned to have a family Christmas party in 1996. That wasn't something that was their idea. It was Bill McReynolds that called her on the 20th, and he said, some guy called Charles Carrolt, he had a on-the-road television show, and this guy's going to be in Boulder, and he'd be filming McReynolds as Santa. And so Bill called Patsy and said, would you mind having a party so that they could do this? And Bill McReynolds strongly encouraged Patsy to have the event. It's almost like, he had to twist Patsy's arm into having a party, and so it was almost like Patsy was doing Bill McReynolds a favor. Do you know what I mean? And so Patsy writes that she agreed to this, and she did it because the children would love the excitement of the TV cameras. The children would love it, so that's why she would do it. And Patsy also said, they had a couple of friends that they could invite. Why not? Why not have this party? But it's sort of sketched in a way that it's, in this setting, it's sort of sketched like not a lot of things were kind of going on. In that same section, Patsy sort of says, they usually had a family Christmas party a few days before Christmas, but then she said, but that year they didn't really plan on it. They didn't really plan on having a family Christmas party in '96. But as it happened, and this is, round about 10 days after the huge church party, on December the 23rd, they had 31 people arrive for their party, 2 days before Christmas. The Whites, the Fernies, the Steins, the Barnhills, which is the neighbors, and their children, and there were a couple of house guests as well. And then Patsy sort of diverts to talking about the dog. She talks about Jacques, the dog, for like the next page or so, next page and a half, in the middle of talking about this Christmas party. And then it eventually kind of comes back to the Christmas party, and then sort of in a small little paragraph right at the end, she mentions that during the party, Fleet White, one of their pals, the people they went to for Christmas dinner, so that was another kind of event that they had on Christmas Day, this dinner. And that's where the last photo of JonBenet was taken. But it was this guy, Fleet White, who, according to Patsy, used their phone, and not just once, but he was making a lot of calls. He was phoning, and he was trying to help his mother in a hospital in Aspen. That was kind of what was going on. And according to Patsy, she says, apparently, like, not this is the reason, just according to her understanding, Fleet dialed the wrong, he dialed wrong, and he got 911. And what's very interesting with this is the same kind of thing happens literally 3 days later, where Fleet White is with John when John discovers, in inverted commas, JonBenet in the wine cellar. And when John runs upstairs, Fleet is actually the one shouting, and he's the one that wants to call 911. And so guess who calls 911? Well, it wasn't Fleet White. It was also not John Ramsey. It was Detective Arendt. Detective Arendt actually said call 911, and she ended up calling 911. So essentially what happened here was Fleet White sort of ran up the stairs, shouted call 911, and then Arendt kind of said to John to call 911, and then in the end Arendt called 911. But if we go back to Death of Innocence, what Patsy refers to here is that Fleet made a mistake calling 911, and the police called back. But after checking with Fleet and the rest of the folks in the house, it was Susan Stein who kind of told the police, well, the call was a mistake. And what's sort of implied here is that the police phoned, and Susan Stein answered the phone and said, oh, sorry, it was a mistake. But what also may have happened is that there was a dropped call, the police called back, there was no answer, and then the police went to the residence, and then there was someone at the door who spoke to them. That's the other version of that story. And Patsy sort of cryptically concludes that this whole call, the 911 call on the 23rd, and I quote, still remains somewhat of a mystery, end quote. So even she's sort of going, kind of shrugging and saying, I don't know how it happened, I don't know what it's about. And so that brings us back to Steve Thomas's book. You've got to go from the one book to the other, the one website to the other, to get the full story, or to get another aspect of the story. And so in Steve Thomas's book, he adds a very interesting postscript where he talks about during the party at her parents' home, a family friend noticed at JonBenet that hadn't been seen very often, a side to JonBenet that was unfamiliar to most people. And Steve Thomas refers to just how she was dressed immaculately, and how her hair shone, and how beautiful she was, and yet she was sitting alone on a staircase in the kitchen crying. So this person found JonBenet sitting on her own on the stairs crying, and it wasn't her parents that found it, wasn't her brother, it was just a family friend that's not known, not named here. And this unnamed family friend sat down next to her and asked, what's wrong? And JonBenet said, I don't feel pretty. On the 20th anniversary, the research that went into the Craven Silence trilogy got a little bit of airplay in the Australian media in two different articles. Interestingly, none of that got repeated across the Atlantic in the States. No one was interested. It just wasn't picked up on. Now, it's easy to sort of get confused and even bogged down and kind of muddled with all the activity that was going on. So you can get really caught up in all the pageants that JonBenet was involved in. You can get caught up in her health and what was going on with her health. You can get caught up in the Christmas parties that were held inside the home. You can get caught up in the Christmas narrative and the Christmas present buying. You can get caught up in the 911 call. It's almost like there's so much to look at that you not sure what you are looking at. And so in this episode we're really going to look at one thing, and it's actually very good to look at each of these things separately. Look at the pageants as a narrative on its own, of its own accord. Look at the traveling to New York and the buying of gifts, and all the buying of gifts, the bicycles and everything else. What were all the gifts bought, when were they bought, as a separate narrative. Looking at the health situation as a separate narrative. Look at what was going on at school as a separate narrative. Look at what was going on with the church friends and the historic houses, home tour, and all that kind of thing. And so the best way to figure this stuff out is to investigate those narratives as narratives on their own, and then put those narratives together and say, what are those narratives together complementing one another? What are they pointing to? And we're not going to do that here. We're just being explicit that these other narratives exist, right? And that this one, the one about John Ramsey's business, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not just this. But in this episode we're going to spend a few minutes just focusing on this one aspect. And so probably the first point to highlight is the timing that this happens. Access Graphics celebrates their 1 billion mark in late December, on December the 21st. The luncheon actually happens the day before, on December the 20th, where 300 employees of the company assemble at the Hotel Boldorado. And so once again you've got this huge party, this huge event. One party with 300 people, another one with 150, another one with 30. But and then also the street parades and the shopping and so on. But in terms of, this was a really, really big party that John was at, and he's not just an employee attending this party. He's the buckaroo. I mean, he's the head honcho, and so he's kind of the guy that's being celebrated. He's the guy that has led this company and led the employees into this bonanza. And so obviously they're going to be toasting him, and he's going to be toasting, and he's going to be the one who needs to be at the center of it, and who needs to sort of credit the people that need to be credited, and needs to sort of bring in people from other branches, and sort out their accommodation, and basically just be the centerpiece of this huge event. And of course this event involves drinking and revelry and celebrating, and anybody in those circumstances would be celebrating. And the fact that it's happening around Christmas, at sort of holiday time, there's festive cheer, it's all the more reason to just really kick off your shoes, let your hair down, and enjoy yourselves. You've achieved something, and it's great. You're happy about it. You are letting the pressure off yourself a little bit. You're indulging a bit. You kind of enjoying the good times. It's the good times, right? And so in one respect you sort of see John in his own sort of universe here. This is John where he belongs, like if Patsy belongs in the pageants and that kind of thing. This is where John believes. He's a businessman, he's an entrepreneur. In fact, that year I think he was voted the entrepreneur of the year by Boulder's Chamber of Commerce. So he's really being celebrated. But when you sort of go into the fabric of it, you realize kind of what was going on. John wasn't just a businessman. A lot was going on. In 1990, Access posted 59 million in sales, and had 120 employees according to the Boulder camera, and revenues had grown 1,600%. Employment had grown 358% to 550 employees. Of those, 380 were in Boulder, and John was kind of the the brains behind all of this. He was kind of at the center of it. He was building this kind of empire. But there were also 100 employees in Europe, 20 in Mexico City, 12 in Canada. He was building a multinational. There were warehouses in California and Pennsylvania, and John had to, he had to go to some of these places. He had to fly overseas. He had to be here, be there. So he undertook a lot of business trips for this, these big acquisitions and these big business ventures that they were getting into. And as a result, John wasn't home very much, and there's a moment where JonBenet says to the gardener, Scott Gibbons, I miss my dad. I remember, she sees Scott Gibbons sort of raking up the leaves or something, and then she remembers her own father doing that and kind of saying to the gardener, that reminds me of my dad, and I miss him. And so she's communicating that she's feeling a little bit neglected. She's feeling a little bit like, where's dad? I don't see him around much. And so if you just take John Ramsey and you just take that business success, you can argue that very, very close to Christmas, because of this party right then, that's what John's focusing on. That's what he's the center of. And that's where he is. That's what's kind of going on. And then you can say, is there any relationship between that and what happened, a few days later? And you might say yes or no. And then you can also ask the question, was there any sort of link between all the revelry, not just this in the business sense, but all the pageants and all the Christmas parties? Was that not sort of, all this attention to lots of people? Was it maybe not causing kind of a dilution of attention to, for example, JonBenet, maybe even Burke? But basically what you're trying to get at is, in this sort of frenzy of parties and just enjoying themselves and in the run-up to Christmas, and as I say, there was a lot to celebrate. It's not that they weren't justified in celebrating, but the question is, how did this crime happen, and what was going on? And while the Ramseys say, well, it was while JonBenet was at this parade that her predator was awakened and triggered, one could also look at it in another way and say, all of these parties kind of allowed a weariness to creep into the family as a whole, the entire family. Just fatigue from running around and being everywhere, and by the time Christmas came, maybe there was some weariness, and maybe with some family members more than others. So another aspect just to highlight in this Daily Camera article is just where year on year, and this is just quite interesting, is that between 1995 and 1996, Access Graphics grew 25%. Now, that requires work. That requires hard work to get these kinds of results, and so that's just another aspect. Is it just shows that JonBenet's father was working really, really hard in the run-up to Christmas in 1996. Not only that, JonBenet was working very, very hard in terms of her pageants. And that's really just the point that I'm trying to make, is this fabric of what each family member was doing and busy with. And then when you think of Patsy's voice talking about waking up and getting dressed that morning, and just you can hear the weariness in her voice. It came from a place of looking forward to a 40th birthday party, looking forward to the holiday, and looking forward to all these celebrations. But something devastating happened in the middle of all of this jovial celebration, right? And so the question that's being posed here is, could all of this celebration, not just in one area, one dimension, but in many dimensions at the same time, could it have precipitated this disaster, right? And that's all, that's as far as I want to go with this narrative. We will pick it up tomorrow with the day after Christmas, what happened subsequent to the event. So we're not going to be dealing with the actual incident in the next episode. We'll be dealing with the aftermath. What happened in the aftermath close to 23 years ago today, JonBenet. Thank you for listening. Again, just a reminder, my book Christmas Star is out. It's just less than 100 pages. It deals with some brand new analysis and brand new information regarding the new last photo that was released this year. So check that out. And thank you for listening.